Kingdom Writers. And today I'm super excited. We're sitting down with Jennifer Michelle Greenberg. And if you're writing about abuse or trauma in your work, and I know so many of you are, you're going to want to tune into this. You're going to want to pay attention and just get ready for this interview. She's a tremendous resource. She's written a book called Not Forsaken. And so many writers struggle to capture trauma and abuse. And it's a really difficult thing to do. You know, there's ethical parameters and just storytelling
Mhm.
parameters that have to be considered. So I'm excited to bring her to you guys as a resource today. But before I do that, I just want to remind you guys about the School of Kingdom Writers. So if you're new with us today, please take a moment to subscribe to the School of Kingdom Writers on your favorite podcast app. You can also follow us on our Facebook page where we do these live. We are a 2-year vocational training program, and we're teaching writers to leverage the media for Jesus. So we're teaching bloggers and podcasters, novelists, YouTube and social media content creators to take those platforms and to use them, you know, sort of as indigenous missionaries on those media platforms to reach Americans. And when we look at the world today and we ask, where are Americans? You know, Paul, he went around the ancient Roman world and he went to the forum or the temple or the marketplace. He went where people were. And when we ask the question, where are people today? They're on social media. You know, they're interacting with all different kinds of media, and that's where we're developing new ideas. That's where we're defining what conversations are acceptable and what aren't. And so here's something that the Apostle Paul said that I want to share with you today. He said, "For you were once darkness, but now you are light in the Lord. Live as children of light, for the fruit of the light consists in all goodness, righteousness, and truth, and find out what pleases the Lord. Have nothing to do with the fruitless deeds of darkness, but rather expose them. For it is shameful even to mention what the disobedient do in secret. But everything exposed by the light becomes visible, for it is light that makes everything visible." And that's Ephesians 5:8-13. And so, you know, I'm excited to have a guest like Jen on today, who is doing that work of exposing darkness, you know, who is taking that mandate seriously. And so, Jennifer, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you, Brad. I'm really honored to be here.
And so, you know, I was checking out your website. I've been following you on Twitter for a while, and we've exchanged a few times there, but I was checking out your website and you do all kinds of things. You're like a super talented, multimodal person, right? You're doing music and books and just all kinds of stuff.
Yeah, I have a lot of fun. I have a new album called Symbiotic. It's out on Spotify, Amazon, iTunes, pretty much everywhere now. And that's just kind of, for me, writing, whether I'm writing a book or an article or a song, it's kind of the same medium. It's just sort of a different manifestation of it. So I really enjoy expressing myself both poetically, but then more in an autobiographical style, like with my book. And I think musically, I can express my maybe more raw emotions. And of course, in Symbiotic, a lot of the songs are inspired by classic literature. So you've got everything from Shakespeare to Agatha Christie to P.G. Wodehouse to Jane Austen. And so there's this kind of smorgasbord of everything from dark to funny to satirical and philosophical. So it's been a really fun medium for me and just kind of a way for me to stretch my writer legs.
Yeah, well, how do you keep it all straight? I mean, because you've got kids at home and
I
you
don't.
got all. Oh, you don't? I'm sorry. I thought you did. My apologies. But
No,
but none.
that's all an illusion.
Okay, that's all part of the Twitter vibe, I guess. But no,
It is,
I'm
yes,
just
yes.
joking. But okay, but nonetheless, you have all these different projects in play. How do you manage it all? How do you prioritize and keep it straight?
I think, this is probably going to sound funny, but a lot of it has to do with my priorities on any given day. For example, I've got my 4-year-old home, and so while she's home, I
Wait, so
need
you do
to
have
spend
kids?
time.
There are
Oh
children
yeah,
involved. Okay.
I have 3 kids, but 2 of them are usually in school for half the day. So
Okay.
during that time, I have a little more free time. But yeah, when they're home, it's just utter bedlam. And so, I spend time with them, and that's always my priority when they're here. And then Jason's parents live pretty close to us. And so every couple days, her grandpa comes and takes her out to McDonald's and the park and everything. And then I kind of get my time to write or play piano or what have you. And so, I carve out these little times when I can creatively express myself. And then when she's here, I'm mostly making sandwiches and chocolate milk and cleaning up messes. Yes.
Sure, sure. I can relate to
Yeah.
that. And so when you mentioned
Yeah.
Jason, and so in your book, Not Forsaken, you say that that started as like a letter to Jason, to your husband, right?
It
To
did.
kind of
Yes.
explain yourself more or less.
Yeah. And, I think that if I was going to give advice to fellow writers who are struggling to write about traumatic or emotionally sensitive topics, one thing that really did help me was writing to Jason, writing to my husband, writing to someone who wanted to understand me, wanted to listen, and who had a vested interest in coming to understand how I think and how I feel. And so that just kind of broke down any kind of writer's block or nervousness that I might have had about sharing a lot of the sensitive issues that I did share about. And it also just it was funny because I set out to write to Jason, but then I started realizing that I was learning more about myself, in the writing
Yeah.
process. And I was discovering, oh my goodness, I think this way because this event happened to me. And I think this way because I was taught this as a child. And so I started tying all that stuff together. And then after I realized that that was happening, I started growing closer and closer to Christ. And that really blew my mind because in my attempt to make myself understood to my husband, I ended up understanding God better. And it was such a surprising turn of events for me. But I realized probably about halfway through my writing process that Jesus is an abuse survivor too.
Oh,
He
wow.
was betrayed and he was beaten up and he was gaslighted, right? He was called crazy and a drunk and a liar and demon possessed. He was falsely accused and even held hostage and murdered, so who can relate to me better than the God who created the universe? Because he's
Yeah.
been there. And so when I connected that up, I mean, the writing really flowed. And I wrote about 90,000 words in 9 months. Like it was
Wow.
insane. And I mean, maybe not for like the typical author, but for me as a mom of three, it was insane.
That's a lot. Yeah,
And
definitely.
it was a lot. And my husband was supportive through the whole process, so he would like watch the kids in the evenings, a couple nights a week, so that I could just focus on my writing and stay up till midnight or whatever and get all that out. And yeah, it was a really neat experience, and I'm excited to do it again.
That's amazing. Well, so tell us the story. I mean, for somebody that doesn't have any familiarity with this book, what's it about?
Sure. Well, Not Forsaken is about my survival. Actually, it's more like about my recovery from 2 decades of child abuse and domestic violence, sexual abuse, psychological abuse, spiritual abuse, you name it. And but it's less about what happened to me. Like the first chapter chronicles some of the autobiographical part, but we put most of that stuff, or actually probably 98% of that stuff, in the first chapter so that say an abuse survivor or an abuse victim is reading this and they're worried about getting triggered, they could just skip that chapter
Yeah.
and move on to the more encouraging and spiritually growing type stuff. But at the same time, we wanted to include that because it kind of establishes my credibility. Like I know what I'm talking about,
Right.
not because I have a PhD, not because I'm a therapist or whatever, but because I've been there. Like I've walked this road, for over 20 years, and I know what it's like to experience PTSD, and I know what it's like to get married and establish a relationship and build a marriage, despite the fact that your own parents' marriage was such a wreck. So that just kind of, I think, established that here's who I am, this is how I know what I know, and this is what I've learned. And so the book really just kind of chronicles my recovery process through coping with depression, suicidal ideation, learning to relate with Jesus on a personal level, like we talked about, learning to define what love is, because
Yeah,
when we grow up in a home where love is when someone wants to control you, or when someone is jealous of you, or when someone you know, uh, is cruel to you. That's how I used to define love. And so I had to relearn what it is, and not just the dictionary definition, but God's definition, the Bible. What does the Bible say? Um, and so that was really a journey. And then I think I don't want to say the most important chapter, but maybe the most pivotal chapter for me personally, and I think for a number of my readers, is the chapter on forgiveness, because there's so much just unsatisfactory teaching about forgiveness. I think a lot of
definitely. Yeah.
people, yeah, a lot of, nothing against them, but a lot of pastors, when they preach on forgiveness, they're thinking about forgiving someone who, dinged their car door with a shopping cart, or, spilled coffee on their carpet. They're not thinking about someone who, beat you for 20 years. It's just like,
Right.
it's a totally different like manifestation of level of because you have to cope with the whole emotional trauma aspect of things, and you're also a lot of times dealing with someone who isn't repentant.
Right.
And if they're not repentant, and you let them back into your life, or you trust them when you shouldn't, you can end up getting hurt very badly, or you could put your kids at risk. I mean, there's just it's just such a dangerous and sensitive topic. And so I really wanted to make sure that I handled it in a safe and responsible and biblical way. And I think that I achieved that. And didn't kind of give it the oh well, Jesus said forgive your enemies and therefore you have to, sort of treatment that it
Mhm.
too often gets. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, and so how did you make decisions about what to include and what not to include? I noticed a couple times you allude to like, well, there was other stuff that I decided not to include in the narrative, right? So like,
Yes,
how do you make that decision?
it was really hard. Some of it came down to well, part of the, particularly in the autobiographical part. So if whenever you're writing an autobiographical book, you are naturally going to have to allude to things that other people did or other people said, and that can open you up to liability. Okay, so what you want to do is, first of all, you'll want to work with a lawyer, and that's kind of an involved process, and it can get pretty darn pricey. But you want to basically document everything that you share. And so, like, for example, I spoke with my relatives, my friends, and I got their version of all the stories that I shared in my book. So I have their testimonies written down. I have emails, I have texts, I have police records, I have divorce
So
records,
you're
I
just trying to
have,
document as much as you can at this point.
yes,
Yeah.
all that documentation. And then you can sit down and say, okay, this story is definitely documented. This other story over here, it really did happen, but I can't document it. And therefore, we're just going to leave that one out. And so there's some of that that happens. Um, and then the other thing I think that was pivotal to me for deciding which stories or which issues to deal with and which not to is just, what am I emotionally ready to handle?
Yeah.
What have I recovered enough from to deal with or to speak knowledgeably about? Because, when you're too emotionally close to something, it's naturally going to color how you express yourself, what you think, your perception. And so I wanted to make sure that the issues that I dealt with, I was kind of at a safe enough space where I could look at them with relative objectivity.
Hmm.
And then of course, my editor and some my husband and proofreaders were really helpful too, and just kind of saying, okay, Jen, you know, I get what you're saying here, but you're arguing it more emotionally. And so what's a way that we can argue this more logically or more biblically, and or how can we kind of double that up?
Right.
It's like give the emotional argument, but then also give the biblical basis for it. So, all that played into what we included.
Did your publisher, were they active in that process?
Oh, very. Yeah, it's actually really interesting. When I set out to get a contract, um, I was dreading the editing process. I thought, because I've worked with newspapers and magazines and different editors before, and sometimes you get a good one, and sometimes you get one who's just kind of a diva and wants to like,
Sure.
imprint their own voice into your writing, and then other times you just get someone who just corrects things because they feel like they need to be doing their job, and they're
Right.
just correcting stuff,
It's like a home inspector, right? You hire them to find
Right.
stuff, so they do, right? But yeah,
Exactly.
yeah,
Exactly. Yes. And, but I was working with Carl Lafferton, and he was just wonderful. I mean, he was like talking to a counselor. He'd go through my writing, and he'd approach everything with just so much compassion and wisdom and understanding. And he brought a lot of, I think he filled in a huge gap in the writing of the book as well, because he's not an abuse survivor. And so he was able to look at some of my stories or some of my conclusions and say, wait a minute, Jennifer, I get what you're saying, but why are you saying it this way? Like, what's motivating
hmm
you to look at it this way? And so then I was able to say, oh, someone who's never been through this wouldn't necessarily know.
yeah,
And so that was just very helpful. And like I said, he just did it with so much compassion. In fact, it was almost kind of funny because sometimes he'd email me with like a correction or an idea, and he'd say, now I don't want this to come off as insensitive. And I was like, Carl, you're the most compassionate person that I've ever worked with on a project. So it was really great. And I felt like I actually grew spiritually through the process. And so that's another reason that I'm eager to do this again. Is just because it was awesome. I felt like I grew a lot.
yeah. Well, and I hope you do, because you're a really talented writer, and I think it's a good book.
Thank you.
And
Thank you so much.
yeah, well, you kind of touched on the idea of retaliation a little bit, and we talked about this right before
Yeah.
we came on as well. Have you experienced any of that? I mean, I think that's what everybody's afraid of, right? Is if I write my story, this person's
Yes.
going to come back in my life, or they're going to sue me or something like that.
Right.
What's your experience been?
Um, I lost a good deal of relationships. There were quite a number of people who I didn't even expect to retaliate, but who just kind of went silent. I don't, some of it, it's just like there was no explanation. They just stopped responding to my texts and my emails, and that was really heartbreaking. Others, they, blew up at me and called me a liar, and were really upset. And I just pointed them back to, it's like, well, look, when we were collecting testimonies for the book, you wrote your account of this story. Like, you knew it was going to be in the book, and you said it was okay. Like, you wrote your own version of this. And, but how people feel isn't always logical. And, sometimes they might not even know how they feel until they see your book published. And so, yeah, that was really, really hard.
How do
I
you deal
will.
with that? Like, do you compartmentalize it? I mean, because it's like you're an abuse survivor already, and then you're almost
Yeah.
opening the door to this like new type of like public abuse that's
Yeah.
happening. How do you
Oh,
do that?
yeah. Um, it's kind of savage, really. I think that it's less compartmentalizing, because I'll just be really honest, I'm not good at compartmentalizing at all. Like, if I feel upset, like, everybody knows. It's just like Jason's always like, when I'm at work, I'm at work, and when I get home, I don't think about work anymore. That is not me. Like, Jason and I don't think the same way at all. He's an engineer, I'm an artist. Like, so my emotions are like my paint, and they're everywhere.
Yeah.
And so, but like I said, it's kind of a savage thing where it's like, as an abuse survivor, I don't want to be lied to anymore. If someone has a problem with me sharing the truth, then I'd rather know than go on thinking that they care about me, or thinking that they're my friend, or that they're an advocate, or that they're supportive of who I am and what I've been through. Because, if they're going to pretend to be my friend or pretend to love me, but then turn on me as soon as I share what they know actually happened, well, then they never loved me in the first place. And I'd rather know than go on being lied to. So as
That's easy to say, but
horrible,
hard to do, right?
Yeah, well, I did it, and yeah, it's
Yeah.
awful.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's really, really painful. There were many, many nights and days of tears, but I am blessed with a very supportive husband and very supportive in-laws and a great pastor. And so everything, I think it was just, I think it was just God cleaning house in my life. That's really, really what it was, because,
Hmm.
as people, we can't control how other people feel or what they're going to do, how they're going to respond. All we can do is make the best decisions we know how to and speak the truth in love and honor God in the best way we know how. And if they choose to, go bonkers, well, I can't
Right.
control that. And so you can't put that on yourself.
Yeah.
Yeah. But I mean, coming to that understanding, I'm still working on it.
Sure. No, I get that. I don't think
It's
that
a
should never
process.
end, right? If you feel like you're
No.
done, you probably screwed it up somewhere, right?
Yeah. Or
Um,
you're in heaven. That could
right.
be.
Yeah.
Yeah.
This is a better alternative. Um,
Yes.
well, and I think a lot of people that want to write a book like this, one of the things they struggle with is imposter syndrome, right? That kind of question of,
Yeah.
sure, everybody has their story to tell, but you've done, most of your book is kind of told from a place of expertise, right? Of like,
Sure.
I'm gonna teach you some things.
Hmm.
How do you deal with that feeling, right? Because like you said, you're not a PhD or a counselor, I don't
Right.
think, right? All right. And so yeah,
Yeah.
how do you personally, how did you approach that piece of it?
Well, I mean, God gave me this story and he gave it to me for a reason, and I'm going to share it. It's my testimony. And I think we should never be ashamed of the story that God gives us. It's an honor to be loved by God.
Yeah.
It's an honor to have God guide you through something, no matter how terrible that thing is, whether it's your own sin or someone else's sin. When God pulls you out of a bad situation, when He leads you to Himself, that is a profound honor, and it's a blessing, and it's a gift, and it's something that needs to be shared, and you should never be ashamed of sharing that.
Hmm. No, that's good. And
So,
well, uh, you know, I coach a lot of people on their writing, and a lot of people have this story of trauma or abuse that they want to talk
mm,
about. And I almost always coach them like, that's a great thing to write, but that might not be the thing you publish, right?
yes.
Because
Oh,
it's
yes.
sad
Yeah.
to say this, but it's not that uncommon of a story, right? There are so many
Hmm.
books and things that are already doing that thing really, really well. It's
Yeah.
hard to break into the marketplace, but I think that you have, I mean, you have thousands of readers that have read this book at this point. At least that's what my Kindle tells me when I went to highlight
Yeah.
things. And so, and
Oh, I need to
so,
look at that. I haven't even looked to see what they've highlighted. I'd be really curious to
yeah,
see. Like, and
that'll
why are
help
they
for the next
highlighting this?
book. Yeah.
Yeah,
But
exactly.
how did you purposely set out thinking, I want to identify a hole in the marketplace, or was that just kind of an organic thing that happened?
That was a very organic thing that happened. And um I think if there's a hole in the if there's a hole if there's a hole anywhere, I think it's in courage. There's a lot of people who either have a story and they're not ready to tell it, and that's totally fine. But then there's a lot of really godly people who and I'm not talking about abuse survivors here, but there's a lot of really godly people who have wisdom, who have knowledge, who have expertise, and they choose not to share it. And I think that's really a tragedy. And so someone like me, I feel that I can fill a gap because I have this expertise, not by a 4-year degree, more like a 20-year degree. um, it's a very lengthy education process. Um,
And I laugh. I shouldn't laugh. I don't I don't know whether to
no,
laugh at that or not.
it's one thing that my experiences have given me is a really dry and kind of dark sense of humor. And it's just, you have to laugh at these things. I mean, you do, because otherwise you'll be depressed and sad and frustrated all the time. And I would much rather just kind of just like, okay, well, this is what I learned out of that. So I just think that's just a more healthy way for me to deal with it. But yeah, so I never set out fill a hole in the marketplace, or to write something that I thought other people would like, um, or that necessarily was even going to be like a big hit. I mean,
Mhm.
like I said, I started out writing letters to my husband because I wanted him to understand what I'd been through, and I wanted him to understand why I am the way that I am. And then as I started sharing chapters with my pastor and friends, like my pastor at the time, uh, he told me, this is a really important work, and if you publish this, it could change the way that the church handles abuse. And then I started realizing that I'm actually holding something that is really important, and it's not just something, it's not mine, it's not
Mhm.
my story in a real sense. It's God's story. It's God's story of redemption in my life. And because of that, it's something that needs to be shared, whether I publish it on my blog or through a publisher. It just needs to be shared. And by God's grace, I wound up with a spectacular publisher.
Yeah.
But yeah, I was totally planning to just post it on my website if that fell through.
Yeah.
So
Well, yeah, and let's talk about that. So you publish with the Good Book Company, right?
yes, yeah,
And so they typically accept unagented proposals, right? So
they are.
you
Yes,
approach
they're
them
very cool that
prior
way.
to the complete manuscript, is that right?
Yes.
So what was your
Well,
experience like there?
yeah. So that was it was really interesting. So I had, for about 6 months, I'd been pitching to, literary agents. And I don't know if this is always the case, but I think it was just with the agents that I was pitching to, because I probably didn't know what I was doing. But they seemed to mostly represent pretty established authors, people who they knew they were going to get a solid cut whenever they signed a contract.
Yeah,
And that just makes good business sense, because they got to buy groceries and pay rent too. They can't
sure.
just be like, sure, I'll market your book.
Portia's
I
not
mean,
going to pay for itself, right?
right,
Yeah.
exactly. They don't know. So, but anyway, that kind of flopped. And then it was funny because Joe, who happens to run the Good Book Twitter page, followed me on Twitter. And so, of course, whenever a publisher follows you on Twitter, you're like, ooh, who's this? Right.
Sure.
So I was like real excited. And then I saw I saw Sarah Walton's book, and I saw like JD Greer and John Piper and I think Russell Moore and like some other authors that like if I hadn't read them myself, I knew who they were just by reputation.
Yeah.
And I started looking at the topics and realizing, oh my goodness, they talk about sexuality, and they talk about depression and anxiety and relationships. And I could fit in here. This my book would fit in their catalog. And so I got my little, what do you call it? Oh, on their website, they had a thing, they probably still have it, where they outline like what they want.
Hmm.
And so I was just very meticulous in following their instructions. And I put together a package for them, and I submitted it. And I'm not even joking, like probably like 10 days later, I got an email from Carl saying like, I'm sure you have, other publishers lined up already, but how soon do you need an offer from us? And I mean, I was just like, I was so excited. I can't even tell you. And
Did you bluff? Were you like, well, Carl, actually, I do. And
he was like, is 2 weeks fast enough? And I was like, yes, Carl, I do believe that 2 weeks will be fast enough. And but I didn't, I mean, I'd sent it to other publishers, but I hadn't heard anything back really. Actually, I take that back. I had heard from a couple publishers, and I'd gotten some feedback, but it was like really vague. I mean, I'm sure everybody's gotten that, where it's like, she says the word I too much. Just like, that's why we have editors.
right.
I don't understand. Like, so, and I was, I'm very gung ho. I was like, well, hey, what if I just edit it, and I could like say I less, and I don't know. But anyway, so the Good Book, went ahead and offered a contract. And so we got all that worked out. And kind of the rest is history. Well, like I said, the editing process was awesome. And then the marketing process was really fun too. Um, I used to actually be a director of public relations at, that's kind of the same thing actually, um, at a marketing agency. And so I knew a lot about marketing. And one of the reasons why I was particularly excited about the Good Book is because I love their cover designs.
Mhm.
I love their website. Like that was a big deal for me. Like if I'm going to have a publisher and they've got kind of a cruddy looking website, then I just kind of know that their marketing isn't going to be something that is on par for me.
Sure.
So like my main thing whenever I looked for a publisher was I wanted marketing. Otherwise, like if they're just going to like publish my book and it's just going to sit in a warehouse, like what's the, I can do that myself, right?
Sure. Yeah.
So yeah, but they just had brilliant cover design, brilliant marketing. I loved everything that they were doing, and I loved the way that they were representing their other artists, their other authors, their artists, right? Yeah, and so it was just a great fit and a great experience. And
Well, of
if I get
course.
the chance, I'll definitely work with them again. Yeah,
Well, and of course, they've got a great stable of other people to work with. So Russell
they
Moore, you
do.
mentioned, wrote your introduction,
Yes.
and so for those that don't
Yeah.
know, he was the president of the Southern Baptist Convention for a long time, right? Like
Yep.
that's a big deal to have somebody like that write your introduction. Did they set that up
Oh
for you,
yeah.
or was your hand in that?
Um, no, they set that up. And then and it was actually really torturous because so what happened was they they told me, I knew that they'd sent him my manuscript and they'd asked him to write an intro or an endorsement or something like that. And so I was just kind of waiting. And then I got an email and they were like, Russell Moore wrote the intro to your book. And that was it. And I was like, but what did he say? Like, and so then I had to wait like a week. And that was pretty funny because I think I don't know if they thought that they'd attached it and they didn't or what, but yeah, it was like, I was all excited. Like I wanted to celebrate. And then Jason was like, what are we celebrating? And I'm like, I'm not sure yet, but it's exciting.
Right. There's no way this is a step in the wrong direction, right?
Exactly. We know it's good, but we don't know how you like, we don't know what it is yet. Yeah.
Right.
So, and then of course his introduction is just beautiful and sweet and thoughtful and really down to earth, just like he
Very
is. I
Russell
mean, I
Moore,
got to,
yeah.
yeah, just like talking to a friend. And he was like that. I got to meet him actually at the ERLC conference, the year that the book was released, 2019. So it was the, oh goodness, my brain. We're just gonna blame mom brain, even though
Sure.
my youngest is almost 5. I'm still blaming that. But anyway, it was their their Caring Well for Abuse Survivors conference, and looking at the Church Cares Well for the Abused book that they published like right in front of my face. Anyway, so yeah, so I got to meet him, and he's really kind. Like he didn't talk about abuse, he didn't talk about business, he just talked about kids and family and pets and fun stuff. And so that was really neat.
That's
I
nice.
enjoyed
Yeah.
that a lot. Yeah.
That's cool. Well,
So very
so you've
pastoral.
yeah. And so you've been marketing the book now.
Mhm.
What are you doing that you feel like is really you've kind of hit your stride with? It's working well.
Well, I really enjoy doing podcasts like this one.
Hmm.
Um, I think that from my perspective, and this goes back to my background in PR, I'm all about relationships. And so if I have a choice between putting an ad in a magazine or putting an ad on a website and talking to someone over Facebook Live or tweeting or whatever, I'm always going to choose that direct interactive approach because, as a writer, this is how I communicate. So I'm naturally good at this. But I'm also fairly good at public speaking and I enjoy just having conversations like this one. So I would say, do what you're good at. If
Yeah.
you know that you're good at Twitter, then do Twitter. If you're really good at Facebook, do Facebook. I'm terrible at Instagram, so I don't invest as much time in that.
Mhm.
But if you're good at it, go for it, you know?
Yeah,
So just kind of like figure out what you have time for, figure out what you're good at, and just focus on a few things rather than spreading yourself too thin. Because I found that if I spread myself too thin, it, nothing really gets done, or I do a lot of things not
sure.
very well.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Does anything in particular stand out where you're like, you look back and you're like, ah, that was a waste of time?
Um, Trying to think. I mean, I think not really. You know, because even the things that flopped, I learned from. You know what I
Yeah,
mean? So, like there were a couple times when I think I wrote for like I did a guest post for someone else's website, and you know, that was a great thing to do because I built that relationship, but I think maybe like 10 people read it.
right.
It's like, I don't know.
Yeah,
Spent like 8 hours writing that article. Yeah. But hey, you know, it goes back to like, well, that article did whatever God wanted it to do.
right.
And maybe those 10 people that read it just needed to hear those words right then. So
Yeah, absolutely.
yeah.
Absolutely.
And then as a writer too, we're always processing things. So like you can just rewrite an article and put it somewhere else where it's going to get more exposure. So I kind of don't look at articles as like permanent fixtures or even books as like permanent fixtures, because as you grow, as you mature, as you learn, you can readdress different topics in a different way. So
Sure. Yeah. And there's a
yeah,
hundred ways to recycle that content for other purposes and things, right?
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yep.
Well, and so, and you do a lot of Twitter, and
Too.
and a lot of what you talk about is abuse, right? And
It
so
is. Yes.
a big question that I have for anybody in your position is, when like part of your brand, part of your persona is to focus on something that's really heavy and dark and
Hmm.
even personally difficult, how do you keep your head above the waves? Like how do you stay focused on the light when you got to spend so much time doing that?
Hmm. But when it comes to Twitter, I would say mute and block liberally. um, yeah, there are just and there are some things, you know, it's like I'll tweet it and I'll know that somebody is going to say something stupid. And so I will just not look at the responses for a day or so until I'm ready to go back and look at them, if I ever look at them.
Yeah,
And so just kind of being aware of your emotional status, like, did I sleep well last night? Do I have the energy to deal with this right now? If I tackle this dark and disturbing topic right now, am I going to have the emotional energy and positivity to take my kid to the playground later, you know, or read a book with her later? Or is this going to just kind of wring me out? And so knowing when you have the emotional energy and wherewithal to attack these topics, um, as opposed to just tweeting something fun, you
yeah,
know, and of course, always mix it up. Because again, I said it's about relationships. So if you just, you know, nothing against, there's a lot of people who do a really good job of just hammering one topic over and over and over again. I am not that person. So if you follow me on Twitter, you're going to be hear about my cat. He's listed as my agent, by the way. Um,
does he get
so
a commission? Does he get a cut of
I
that?
pay him. I pay him in tuna.
All
So
right, that's
yes, he
fair.
does.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yes, yeah, he's yeah, exactly. You know, and but yeah, so you're gonna hear about my cat, my kids, all sorts of just silly things that I'm doing throughout the day. Um, but you know, as a survivor, I frequently think about what's happened to me. And of course, as an advocate, I hear stories about other people and situations that they're dealing with. And I hear from pastors who have questions about, like, okay, this is happening in my congregation. What do I do? And so as I'm thinking about those issues, you know, I'm confidential with, you know, whatever I'm dealing with, of course. But, you know, sometimes I'll tweet about, you know, it's like when we hear an abuser falsely accusing someone of being a certain way, a lot of times what that is projection, and I'll go into like, what does projection mean? And so I kind of just, as I'm dealing with things,
Yeah.
as I'm getting those emails, phone calls, whatever, I'm addressing the topics generally, publicly. And so that's just kind of, it's also just kind of how I process things so that I know how I think and how to word things. I don't know. I process a lot of things through writing.
No, and I think that makes sense. Just kind of collecting things as you go, right? Rather than sitting down and trying to conjure up something to tweet about now. I mean, that takes so much
Exactly.
energy, right? And it's practically feels
Right.
impossible. So I think that that's really, really smart.
Yeah.
Well,
Yeah.
so
Live blogging your brain is much more effective than planning.
right.
I find.
Depends on the brain
Yep.
though, maybe. But
Yeah.
um,
Yeah.
so where do you go from here, Jen? What happens next? What do you have in the works?
Well, we just released the audiobook for Not Forsaken, which I am super, super excited about.
Awesome. Yeah.
Yes, Jennifer Fry narrated it. She is a precious friend. She's one of these people who she's compassionate. She's very, I don't know if worldly wise is the right term. I don't mean that in a negative way. I mean that she's got a lot of practical wisdom.
Hmm.
And so she understands the book and she understands the messaging. And I felt that she expressed it in a really effective and just compassionate way. And so listening to her read my book, it's like hearing myself talk to myself, which is really strange, but it's beautiful at the same time. And so I'm just honored to have her talent on that project. And that's available through Audible and Amazon. And it came out, I think it just came out to like 6.5 hours. So it's not a very long listen. And I'm also, one of the reasons I'm excited about it that I learned is that a lot of abuse survivors, they have PTSD from what they've been through. And because of that, sometimes they have trouble focusing on a physical book. They keep getting distracted or whatever. And so they just have trouble sitting down with it. And an audiobook is a way that they can listen while they're taking a walk or on their way to work or doing the laundry, which is usually when I listen to audiobooks. And so, it's a different way for people to kind of absorb the material and benefit from it. And I'm very excited about that.
That's cool. Cool.
Yeah.
And do you have another book in the works? You mentioned there's a study guide or
I
something, right?
Oh yeah, yeah. So and there's also a Spanish edition of Not Forsaken is going to
Oh,
be
wow.
coming out. Yeah, we haven't announced the release date. They're in the process of translating it right now. But that's just, I mean, I'm so excited about that.
Does that make you
That's something.
nervous? Like, how do you check it? Right. I mean, you
Yeah, I
just have
don't
to
know.
have
I I
total
just don't
trust,
think
right?
about that. Yeah, just don't think about that.
All right.
Nope. My Spanish speaking friends like just don't tell me. No, I know that they're going to do a good job. This is a translator that the Good Book has vetted and really respects and speaks very highly of. And so I'm honored to work with them. And I got to speak with the editor, and he's a really sweet, compassionate, pastoral guy, just like Carl, my editor. And so it's just going to be phenomenal, and God's just going to use this, and it's going to be great. So I'm really excited about it. Now, the Shepherd's Guide, that's a really cool thing, or at least I think it is. Um, it's available for free through my website, and what it is, it's a study guide that's geared towards church leaders, counselors, pastors, seminary students who want to learn how to shepherd survivors and victims of abuse. And so each chapter in the Shepherd's Guide goes along with a chapter in Not Forsaken, which actually I have a copy so you can see what it looks like. But each chapter in the Shepherd's Guide goes along with a chapter in Not Forsaken, and it kind of just addresses like different situations that I've seen or been involved with as pastors counseled church members or encountered different situations in their church. I go into like, how do you figure out what your state laws are? How do you know when to report?
Hmm.
How do you identify a narcissistic abuser versus a sociopathic or a psychopathic abuser? How do you encourage an abuse victim who might find even certain verses in the Bible triggering? Like, how do you minister to that person?
Yeah.
And so I delve into all of that. And it's something that ideally you will read along with the book, because I think you'll get a lot more out of it if you're reading the book too,
Mhm.
but it can stand alone as well. And I'm really excited because it's been downloaded by, I think, over 100 different organizations. And that includes churches, seminaries, Christian schools, universities, and even some secular colleges. So that's just been a really exciting avenue. And I was also able to work with law enforcement to kind of double check the counsel that I share in there, to make sure that it's the same as like what law enforcement would
Sure.
recommend. Um, it was that too was a huge learning process for me, and just another exciting way to share the testimony and the story that God gave me. So
That's awesome. Well, Jen, if people like what they're hearing, how can they connect with you or learn more?
yeah, well, obviously Twitter, Jen M. Greenberg. And it's the same handle on Facebook and Instagram, which, as I mentioned, I am bad at. I'm also occasionally on YouTube. I am attempting to do my own podcast. And then, of course, there's my website, jennifergreenberg.net. I had to do .net because there are multiple Jennifer Greenbergs.
All
So,
right.
yes.
Hopefully none of them writing anything weird, right?
Yes,
Okay.
because if they are, it's not me.
All
It's
right.
not me. Anything weird by a Jennifer Greenberg, I'm just washing my hands of it.
All right. Cool. Well, lastly, Jen, could we pray for you today?
That would be awesome. Thank you, Brad.
Yeah, absolutely. So if you're joining with me live, please just join me in prayer. And if you're watching or listening to the recording, your prayers still count. So even if it's, 2035 and the cyborgs have taken over, then you can still pray and it still counts. So please join me. So Lord, I'm really thankful for just your spirit that you poured out into Jen, Lord, in the way that you blessed her to address difficult things. So Lord, we just pray that you give her wisdom and words to say. Lord, I ask that you guide her future projects, Lord. I ask that you protect her spirit, God, as she continues to move forward and kind of evaluate those old highlights and, all the ways that people are interacting with the things she's produced. Lord, I just ask that you'd just bless her with tremendous discernment. And I thank you that you're using her to heal wounds. I thank you that you're using her to bring awareness and to bring delight to something dark. So we just bless her in your name, Lord. We pray for more readers. We pray for more lives saved, more lives touched, more souls in heaven because of the words and the work that you're putting in her heart right now. So we thank you for Jesus. Amen. Well, awesome. So Jennifer Michelle Greenberg, and the book is Not Forsaken. Thank you so much for joining us today. So once again, if this is your first time with us at the School of Kingdom Writers, you can learn more at sokw.org/info. That's INFO. That's a great place to get started learning about us. And if you're interested in being a student, you can learn more at sokw.org/students. So we'd love to have you check out those pages. Don't forget to share this podcast with somebody that's going to benefit from it. So take 10 seconds right now, grab that link, hit that share button, whatever platform you're on, and think of somebody, either a writer that struggled with this stuff, or maybe an abuse survivor that is going to benefit from Jen's story and the book Not Forsaken. So thank you so much for sharing it. Thank you so much for taking a moment to subscribe so that you get future updates and material from the School of Kingdom Writers. And be blessed, and we will see you next week.